Hey, Michelle.
Hey, Steven, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to be in the presence of greatness today between you
Thank
and our
you.
special guest.
Oh, the special guest, right? He's so special. Fine. That's right. We have a special guest today. I was getting so tired of doing Feuertips. No, really. We've been talking about table functions, and we went from regular table function to pipeline table functions. And then a friend of mine, who also is at Oracle, reminded me that there's a certain new feature in Oracle Database 21c that is a kind of table function too. So I said, oh, good. You come and talk about it. So I'd like to welcome Chris Saxon to Feuertips. Could you bring on Chris? Welcome, Chris.
Hi.
So I want to say a few words about Chris before he gets to talk, and he's going to do all the hard work this week. So Chris and I have a pretty long history now. It goes back to the early days of the PL SQL Challenge, which is now called the Oracle Dev Jam. Kind of out of the blue, Chris had been playing the quizzes at the Dev Jam, and Chris approached me. I didn't know Chris from any other developer sitting inside some company in the UK, and said, hey, let's do a quiz on database design. And so I said, great, Chris, let's do it. So he started doing a new weekly quiz on database design, which is a pretty major commitment on the side from his job. All went swimmingly well, the great fun. Then I joined Oracle, and I wanted to build a developer advocates team. And Chris applied for one of the positions. He took the job that I offered to him, and he's been going great guns since. And Chris is now the author of one of the top blogs at Oracle. Is it called All Things SQL?
Yep, All Things SQL.
All Things SQL blog outpaces almost everything in viewership except for Java Magazine and previous issues of Oracle Magazine. So it's been incredibly successful. Chris went on from just writing quizzes at the Dev Jam to also creating classes. And his series on databases for developers, there are 3 different segments, has drawn over 60,000 developers to learn how to use Oracle database and relational databases in general and SQL specifically more effectively. Chris also has the SQL Daily Twitter feed, which is now up to how many followers?
It just passed 15,000 a week or two ago. So
one of the most popular Twitter handles for Oracle database technologies and SQL generally. So Chris has been amazingly successful. I've always said and believed that the best thing I ever did for Oracle by rejoining it was getting to hire 4 new people: Chris, Connor McDonald, Dan McGann, and Blaine Carter. So I'm really, really glad that Chris can be here with us, share his expertise on SQL, and talk about, what are you going to talk about?
So well, you kind of mentioned a bit about following on from table functions, and I was going to lead that in maybe a slightly different direction. We'd talk about SQL macros, which I think they're a kind of table function. They're a function, you write a function, they return a table.
Okay.
Sounds like a table function to me. What do you think?
I'm ready. I'm ready to always expand my horizons when it comes to table functions.
Okay, cool. All right, then. In that case, I will start sharing my screen, and let's just bring it up and go for this one. So that now, hopefully, you can now see, my SQL developer, right?
And it's shared.
Excellent. Alrighty then. So let's just kind of introduce a little bit of a problem to start with. So it's quite common you want to do kind of top-end queries. And here I'm just trying to find the first 3 rows from employees. So that's pretty easy. We added this syntax in 12c, so you didn't have to do the old row num nonsense that we had to do in the past. But there's a more kind of nuanced version of this. Let's say instead of just first 3 people employed by date, we want the first 3 hires in each department, right? There isn't actually kind of like a native that we know that we've got to build it up. First thing we want to do is assign a row number for each person in the department and then filter it down to the first 3. So to assign a row number to the department, we can use the lovely row number function, partition by department, so split it up, only consider values for the same rows with the same value for department, and sort by hire date. And we'll get something like this. And we'll see here we've got this little row num, rnum column on the end that we can then use to filter. So far fairly straightforward, but there is a little kind of wrinkle or potential issue here with using row number like this. Does anyone spot it or want to see what issues we could possibly run into when sorting values and getting the top n? So what this, if I just kind of walk through the logic, let's think we're assigning a unique row number for each thing. What's going to happen?
Well, how does it affect the ordering, right?
Yeah. What happens if two people are hired on the same date, right? Because it's going to happen. Yeah. Matt saying two hired on the same date. So we've got some kind of non-deterministic behavior here, potentially. If we run the query twice and there's two people hired on the same day, we might give them a slightly different, assign them slightly different row numbers. I'll just kind of gloss over that problem for the rest of this talk, but you've got to bear in mind this is something you might need to think about in real production code. But this is a general thing with top-end queries. So we're going to do this, and then we can plonk that into use the lovely with clause as a subquery, and then just filter the result of that. So then that gives us the top three in each department like this. So we can see first three in department 30, there's only two people in department 20, whatever that is, and so on and so forth.
Wait, you don't know what each of the departments are by number? Come on.
There's some things I'll reserve some other SQL knowledge in my brain, right? Okay. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward in terms, I say reasonably straightforward, but we've had to construct the query, and as I said, there isn't native SQL syntax to do this. We've had to go through some numbers of steps to do this, and this is actually a fairly common problem you might run into. You say, for each group, I want to return the top n, and we can do this and have a query a bit like this.
But you need to Saxon to do it.
Well, you say that, but the thing is, it helps, but I don't think you need to be, right? It would be kind of nice if we could actually kind of make this reusable, right? So, someone, maybe me, comes up with this template of a slightly more complicated query and then says, well, it'd be good to hand this out to other people, right? And I can go, Stephen, I've written this function for you, the SQL function, and you just need to plonk in your tables and columns and things like that, right? And this actually traditionally was pretty tricky to do in SQL. There wasn't really a good way to kind of say, I've got a template or a SQL table function. I mean, I know you've been talking about table functions, but to make this generic so we can pass in any table and any columns, it's fiddly, right? There's not a great solution. And
performance-wise, it'd probably be pretty nasty too, building that all dynamic.
Exactly. I mean, we can't bind identifiers. We can't do something like this and use colon table name and try and just pass the table name in at runtime. It doesn't work. Until now we have SQL macros. So Stephen said they're a 21C feature. They were originally slated to be 21C only. Table macros, which I'm going to talk about in the next 5 or 10 minutes, they were backported to 19C, so 19.6. So if you're on 19C and you're patched up to the latest version, you can now use these. You don't have to wait for 21C to actually go ahead and try those out. So I'm going to make our macro. It's going to accept the table, which are grouping and sorting columns, and our number of rows. I'll just skip down a little bit. You can see here I'm returning a string. And it kind of looks a little bit like that query I just wrote, right? You kind of see, if we put them side by side, there's a bit of a template there, and kind of say, well, they match. This template is the query that I want to return. And when we call this function, what the database does is it essentially takes this text and makes it part of your final SQL statement, right? So it does this at parse time, it resolves whatever this is, and we get our final SQL statement. Now, the really neat thing here is you can see I've just got tab here, and it's just written in the string. This is actually a placeholder. If we go back up to our parameter here, tab, the query essentially does a find and replace. It goes, okay, you've got a parameter called tab. Is it in the string? If it is, I will then replace that placeholder with the actual table name that you passed in. We'll see in a second, it does actually do a bit more than that, but essentially that's what it does. So we can pass in our table and how many rows we want, Now you might be wondering now, what's with all this string concatenation, right? If I've had placeholders for the table name, why am I doing all this craziness with the columns? Well, the columns, we've got this new kind of column pseudo operator, which accepts a comma-separated list. And there's not kind of a native way in SQL to take a comma-separated list and turn it into a string, right? Or at least I don't know of one. So we need to kind of iterate through those and just stringify them, essentially make them one big long string of the columns that we're going to use. So once we've created that, let's just make sure I have actually created it. There we go. Yeah, it's created. We can now call it and just pass in our table and the column. So we want the first three hires per department. So we'll pass in department hire date, run it, and there we go. Fantastic. That's exactly the same result as we had in the query I ran all the way back up here. It's essentially exactly the same thing. So I can see there's been lots of comments flying through, Stephen. So is there anything in particular that people...
Why don't we just run through them and we'll catch up, and
yeah,
and then we'll continue.
Yeah.
So I understand that Sql macros are already available in 19C.
Oh.
How about... Whoops, sorry.
Sorry, we're stepping on each other. All right, go ahead.
Is table macros only or everything in 21C?
Yep. So 21, there's two types of macro. Table macros, which is what I'm showing you, and you put them in the from clause. And then there's scalar macros, which return just a basic expression, like multiplying a column, something like that. And you would use those basically anywhere else. You could use a normal PL SQL function, like your select clause, your where clause, your order by clause, that kind of thing. So scalar macros are a 21C feature. They're not going to get backported to 19C. Although, interestingly, someone pointed out to me on Twitter, they have been backported to the 19C version of Autonomous Database, but not the 19C version of the on-premises database. As far as I know, they're not going to go back into the on-premises version of Oracle Database, but they do appear to be there in Autonomous Database. So nice. Hopefully that solves things.
And here's a question that came up. It was answered by one person in the list there, but I thought I'd publish it for everybody. So is it just syntax sugar, the fetch first X rows?
That's a good question, Kevin, actually. And really, it is just syntax sugar. You'll see actually quite a few of the recent code simplification keywords that have been added. They really just map back to the original or an equivalent statement that already existed in Oracle Database. And actually, it kind of maps to something a little bit like this, the row number function behind the scenes. So performance-wise, it's going to be the same as writing your own kind of row number function, but it's much easier to write, right? Okay.
This is a question by Brian. I think back when you first showed the use of the order by, and you add multiple columns onto the order by line.
Right. On here.
Or... not specific to Sql macros, but just...
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you can add multiple columns. Yeah, because if we wanted to make this deterministic, we can add employee ID. I mean, that when we were talking earlier about what happens if two people are hired on the same date.
Okay.
One way to resolve that problem is just stick employee ID or some other primary or some other unique set of attributes to make sure we always get it in the same order. Okay.
All right. I think that's... Mark, I like this.
Go on. Lightning faces.
Mark, the reason for that, and yes, Chris is an intense teacher, but the reason for that is I rarely learn new things anymore. So I'm really, this is hard. It's hard learning new things. I'm out of practice. And actually, I have a question, Chris, on line 110. The columns, is that an operator?
Yes, so I said it's a new pseudo operator, and what it does is it accepts a list of identifiers, so column names. So I can actually do this. I can add employee ID to my list here, and it will include that in how we're sorting the data from then on.
And do those have to be valid columns in HR.employees? Does it actually check against?
No. Well, in this, the query will fail, but not because it's not a valid column, right? Because it's failing ADSF is an invalid identifier, but that's because I'm building up the string here, and essentially ADSDF, whatever it was, is becoming part of that text.
Because you can put whatever you want. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, you're right. You can put whatever you want. You could, depending on what you're doing in your macro, right? Potentially, you could write column names that don't exist here. So they don't have to be real columns, but they do have to conform to like identifier rules. So they can't start with like a.
Oh, it can't be an expression.
Yeah, it can't be something like that, right? Because that's if we quote it, so it's a actual quoted name as opposed to a thing, and now it's failing for that reason.
Well, if you could, a real column name in there, it probably would work with double quotes. But anyway, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It looks like a query. It looks like I'm querying from a table, but I as a developer need to know that what it's actually doing is a text substitution.
Yes,
that is really
exactly.
Something. Okay.
Yeah, and just kind of drive home the point here of it's a text substitution. If I put a bind variable in here, so Tom Kite always was banging on about bind variables and how important they are. To filter the number of rows, you probably don't want to hard code it to 3. I mean, maybe there's some situations where you do, probably not. We can pass in a bind variable, and this is where the font size is going to let me down a little bit, but hopefully you can just about read that it says 5 there. So I'm going to get 5, up to 5 per department. So we can see we get up to 5 for, actually, I skipped over the fact I'm also changing what I've grouping and sorting on. So rather than department and date, I'm sorting by job and salary, who are the 3 lowest people per job in each department. So we can, maybe figure out what we need to do to make them happy. Maybe pay them a bit more or something, perhaps.
Here's a question from Nils. Can you also pass multiple tables to the SQL macros? And if yes, how to specify the corresponding table for the columns?
So that's a good question. Yes, you can have multiple table parameters here. So, I can add table T2 with this table type. In terms of how do you know, that will come down to how you write your SQL statement. I mean, if you've got 2 tables and they both got an ID column or something else where it's ambiguous, you will have to figure out how you're going to do that and do the necessary qualifiers. So you can see we can use table aliases here. So even though it's a generic table name, once I've got the table alias, it knows it's whatever this table is called. So you'd have to use the table aliases to resolve it appropriately. And then it's kind of on you to make sure you've written it correctly so that these kind of things don't happen. All right. Okay. So so we see we've got it with a bind variable. And again, just to show that it's changing, if I put 1 in here, we'll just get 1. So 1 person per department. Now, one of the really neat things about these macros is, as I said, that once you actually execute, or when the database passes it, it takes that text out, does the substitutions as necessary, and then the actual SQL statement that's run is what's come out. This table function just kind of disappears at runtime. So what that means, if we do something like filter like this by job, that's pushed right down to the SQL execution layer. So this is another difference over like normal table functions and things like that. Most of them, you'll do some processing, return the data, and then filter. This, you can see it's actually using that index on that table, which means it's actually been able to push it right down to the employees table, not run the function, get the results.
And also, I know one of the concerns that people have had about VPD, virtual private database, with the row level security is that you can't really see the SQL, and for good reason. That's been modified. But in this case, it's pretty clear, since this is all done pre-parse, what you go in and look at in SQL histories and all the rest of that stuff is the actual SQL being executed.
No, so yeah, SQL you'll look at is here. So yeah, if you want to look in $SQL, you'll look for a query that has this in it. Actually, I can do that quickly. Should be able to do that. There we go, and hopefully we'll see it. So there we go. And you can just about see there, yeah, top end per group.
But
If you want to see what, yeah, okay, you're saying what's really going on here. What's actually going on? There's this DBMS utility thing which came in 12C, 12.1, I think, and this, as the name kind of implies, expanded out. It gets the full final SQL statement we actually execute. So if we run that, notice I've got the bind variable in here, and that will give me this. And it will give me a big statement here. Let's just paste it in, format that a little bit so we can see. You can see there's some extra little stuff it does here.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we can see. So there's my row number with the row num column. Remember I said it's not an exact find and replace. It's done the quoting it to make it, standard identifiers. But there's my row num, and there's my bind variable, right? So it's still taken that bind variable I've passed and made it part of the final SQL statement. It doesn't like peek at its value or manipulate it or do anything with it. It just literally, what it was that you've called it with now becomes part of that final SQL statement. So this is what's really actually executed, and this is what you can see. Onto, was it whoever was asking, was it Kevin earlier about what's going on here? You could also pass this in with the standard fetch first into that. Well, actually, does that work? I'm trying to remember. I'm saying that and now I'm doubting myself. You can pass things in here. You can also use this with views. Very, very useful. We've probably all experienced the thing where you got a query that uses a view, and there's a big complicated query behind that. You'd like to know what's really going on. If you pass a query with a view in here, you get the full underlying thing as well. This is really useful for other reasons besides SQL macros, actually. Right. All right. So, was there a question? What other questions or comments do we have at this point?
Well, there was a question about, hey, what about some links to blog posts? And I did let them know that after the session, we'll post a blog post on Feuertips. We'll have links to Chris's content. It'll be essentially a redirect blog post. But certainly you can go out right now and certainly follow him on Twitter. And if you just do a search on Oracle SQL Macro, Chris is fantastic. You'll find all of his blog posts.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got some posts, and I've got one talking through this top end per group problem generally, and as well as the SQL macros and a bit. Okay, so talked about SQL macros, and now I'll kind of backtrack a version a little bit to talk about another table function, and that is.
Yes. I'm sorry. Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah, go on.
Do you have examples of the non-table macros, like substituting
scalar macros? Yeah. Let's see. I can construct one really quickly. Let's do one really quickly.
I know you focus mostly on the table macros in general.
Yeah.
And probably the most important.
Yeah. I think table macros are certainly the coolest, but the let's just do this. So we're going to return a string. So we're going to return varchar to SQL macro, and we need to say it is a scalar. So that's returning that. And let's just do a multiplier. So we've got our p, which is an integer. So let's just double it, right? So we're going to return p times 2. So that is worked. All right then. So if I select that from dual, and do f of 2, hopefully we will get back to 4. There we go. Exactly. One little thing to watch on this: the expansion trick I showed you doesn't work, or at least it doesn't currently work with these scalar macros. So you can't really see what.
Make sure you name your functions well.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, it sounds like one of the very common use cases for the with clause with function was to isolate redundant formulas. I'm doing the same formula multiple times, code it just once in the PL SQL function, put it in the with clause. It seems like this would be better than the with clause for that kind of situation, because why would it be better, Chris?
Well, there's several reasons. First up, it's just kind of centralized in one place. Chances are you're going to use this many times. I mean, the classic example is things like invoices and order items, where you have quantity times price to get total value. And you might want to do tax and currency conversion and all that nonsense as well. So define it once, and then you can reuse it everywhere, rather than with function with clauses specific to that query. right? So that's probably the biggest one. The second then is as well is it is then down to just pure SQL. One, when you actually run this, what literally really happens is it gets resolved into 2 times 2.
Mm-hmm.
So it's identical as if you just ripped it out and hand coded it yourself, right? So
no context switch to PL SQL.
Yeah, no context switch to PL SQL. You got the optimizer knows or has got as good visibility of what's going on here, which means it's likely to get better plans. There's just there's performance advantages and code reuse and maintainability advantages as well, right? So,
okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I do have a question. Can you find the data type of the bind variable passed in if it was passed in from an application? I think this is a more general question.
Yeah, I think.
Can't imagine because it's going to be implicitly converted, if possible, to whatever's needed inside the SQL statement, right?
I'm trying to remember. There's a view SQL bind capture, and there you go. Look, you can see the data type of that bind variable now. Unfortunately, when it has name here, I think that's just by position. Oh, no, it does have like B1 for some of them. But if you know what your SQL statement is, your SQL ID, and your bind variables, what they are, then you can see what what it was bound as. But then what's Rachel saying?
Then it avoids indexes?
I'm not sure what you're saying there, Rachel, but...
But also, this data type is the data type that SQL has detected from the SQL statement, not the value being passed in, right? So in other words, if the bind variable, if it's salary less than :B1, B1 is going to be a number type, I assume. I could pass a string, it will be implicitly converted to number, so it won't show you the type of the value being passed in, but how SQL is going to treat that.
Yeah, I think it depends on your application, because like in Java, you explicitly say I'm binding a number or I'm binding a varchar. So it probably depends a bit on which programming language you use as well. But yes, yeah.
And listen, Chris, I have a thought. So Chris was about to go on to a second topic. It wasn't going to be as long as this one, but it's fairly complex, polymorphic table functions. It's already almost 11:30. So I think, given that we now switch off and do all the fun stuff, if you don't mind, I suggest we just stick to SQL macros here. We can come back to polymorphic table functions at a future date and not hurry it, not make a big hurry out of it. Is that okay with you?
That sounds great. I think that will work better.
But I won't force you to come back next week. We can give it some time. So folks, that was SQL macros. So the idea is that if you have patterns of, this is the way I'll describe it, Chris, you correct me. If you're seeing patterns in your SQL where you're constantly doing the same kind of stuff over and over again, and among other things, it's tricky to do, see if you can encapsulate it as text. It is going to be tricky to build it, to construct it properly. So probably it's not a beginner exercise, but then you can have it just implemented just once, and you have none of the downsides of the PL SQL context switches and all those kinds of things. Is that a good general use case?
Yeah, I think, as I say, you've got a template of a complicated query that you want to be able to apply to different tables, right?
Mm-hmm.
And think about it that way. And yeah, I think you summed up the advantages pretty well there. So.
Okay. And here's a question from Matt. I think he was watching you using SQL Developer.
Yeah. Yes.
Is that right, Matt? Is that a SQL Developer question? In terms of, maybe it was how you were highlighting the entire statement and then running it?
Oh, I just run the statement. I do, F9, the default, and I don't know, maybe it's a setting I've got that does that, but yeah, I just run it. I'm not sure what else to say at that.
I just press the green arrow, and whatever one it's in the middle of it runs too.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's what Matt was asking about. I'm not sure, Matt. Feel free to clarify.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Chris. So we're going to do 2 more things today. One is Chris is going to share one of his favorite books instead of me doing it. And number 2, I'm going to offer 3 different organizations that InSum will donate $25 to help heal our planet. And Rachel, you've been very active today and asking a bunch of good questions. So if you could pick among the groups, that'd be great. Chris, I'm going to show them the groups first, and then we'll turn it over to you for your book. So this week, I propose the Killam Bear Center. So Ben Killam rehabilitates orphaned wild bear children to be reinserted into the wild and lead productive, wonderful black bear lives. It's an amazing organization. He's a truly amazing guy. I mentioned one of his books, Out on a Limb, several weeks ago, and it's just incredible. Save the World's Coral Reefs. Hopefully, I don't have to explain much here. Coral reefs are the host for the bottom of the food chain of the oceans. And without coral reefs, oh my God, we lose so much on this planet. And bonobos, I mentioned them, I think last week, the week before. So bonobos, they don't have a picture of the bonobos here, which is interesting. Where is bonobos? There we go. Bonobos are like chimps in that they're the nearest cousins to us on the evolutionary ladder or bush or whatever you want to call it. And they are greatly endangered, and we'd hate to lose them for any number of ways. And they're so different from chimpanzees as well and humans. It's fascinating. Okay, so Rachel, give some thought. Let us know which of those 3 organizations you'd like to support, have us support: Kill and Bear Center, Coral Reef Alliance, and Bonobo Conservation. And here's Matt. He was typing SSF, which replaced to select star from. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So those are snippets, right?
Yes, they're called templates or something in SQL Developer, and basically you define a short character code, and I just have my shortcut keys, then it auto expands it. So yes, I forget exactly where, but if you search through the tools and the preferences in SQL Developer, I've got a whole stack of them defined. Okay,
great. And in fact, maybe I'll have Jeff Smith come on for some like PL SQL hot tips for using with SQL Developer. Okay, so Chris, what are one of your favorite books?
Yes. Okay. So this is a book I read during lockdown, so March, April time last year, and it's Tiny Habits by a guy called BJ Fogg. I keep moving the wrong way, but basically, at some point in your lives, I'm sure all of you have tried to make some kind of behavioral change. Maybe you've tried to tidy up more, do more exercise, something like that, and your success with these things may have varied. And basically, he's come up with this kind of framework where he says, focus on the smallest change you can to be that behavior. So if you want to go running, instead of going, right, next week, I'm going to run 5K on Monday and 10K on Tuesday and some other ridiculous plan that's never going to go happen, you say, on Monday, I'm going to put my running shoes on. And that's a habit, right? And the thing, you focus on doing something really small. You have a trigger that you do it. Maybe it's, I don't know, when you get up and you finish your morning coffee or something like that. First thing you do is then you go and put your running shoes on, and then you celebrate because you achieved your habit. And it's just this kind of framework. You start really small and build it up into bigger behaviors. It certainly helped me do things like do a whole bunch of push-ups every morning and various other kinds of.
Can I ask how many push-ups do you do each morning now?
It varies between 10 and 20, but then I do a whole bunch of like stretches afterwards. So it's
great.
Yeah. Go on.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, but I think it's I'm sure every one of you, there's something that you kind of would like to change about your life, maybe big, maybe small, and it's just a very good framework. It certainly helped me, right? So
it looks great.
Yeah,
another book that I saw a few years ago, I discovered, and BJ Fogg came out with his Tiny Habits afterwards, is a book called Switch. And it has a lot of the similar ideas. And one of the core things that really drove home to me is that when you've got a big, complex problem, in general, big, complex solutions fail because we're not good at big, complex things. And of course, things are changing all the time. It's sort of like the waterfall approach to fixing problems, like the waterfall approach to writing code. It's doomed to fail. So one of the things, I can't remember the name of the brothers who wrote the book Switch. One of the things they suggested, which I thought was really cool, is don't worry about all the work to get to your end goal. So you've got your end goal, like I want to run a marathon in a year, and I'm not proposing that, by the way. But I've got a friend who's working towards that goal. I want to run a marathon in a year. What do I need to do tomorrow to start that journey? And just worry about the next step, because if you don't get to the next immediate step, you can't get to the end. You can't even get halfway along. So I think it's a similar idea to Tiny Habits. And I think it's just a nice, simple framing. Don't worry about the far future. What am I going to do tomorrow that will get me started? Okay, so Sven has voted for coral reef protection. Thank you, Sven. The coral reefs will also thank you if they can get your email address. I'll I'll look into that. Chris, thank you so much for joining us, for giving us the cool news about the SQL macros and excellent tip on tiny habits. We will have Chris to come back and talk about polymorphic table functions because they're way too complicated for me. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the SQL macros. And don't forget to subscribe on our Feuertips page. And stay safe, stay healthy, stay masked. Most of all, get vaccinated. All right. Take care, everybody. See you soon.